Morning, everyone. Those we have already with us. Punishing 8 a.m. start, I know, but sorry. Does information want to be free? I have Cory, Doctorow, author, activist, journalist, blogger, and co-editor of Boing Boing, right? And author of millions of books, which I will, I depend on Google to deliver you the titles of those books, and Google to deliver me Katherine Oyama, Senior Policy Counsel. So I'm going to set Cory off first, because you've just written a book with almost that title. So that could last us 30 minutes.
Sure. Well, I mean, the premise of the book is that whatever information wants is not particularly relevant. If abstractions can be said to have desires, those desires are surely not particularly relevant to humans. But humans want to be free. And we live in the 21st century, and the internet is not a superior video-on-demand service. It's not the world's best pornography delivery service. It's not a means of recruiting jihadis. It's the nervous system of the 21st century. And when we impose systems of arbitrary censorship and control and surveillance on the internet in the name of guaranteeing artists a living, which it's fairly dramatically failed to do, we not only fail artists, who perforce should be on the side of free speech and against censorship and surveillance, but we also endanger the wider world. In the name of copyright, we created a regime in 1998 under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that prohibits circumventing digital locks. So if there's a lock that protects a copyrighted work in a device, it's a felony punishable by 5 years in prison and a $500,000 fine to remove that lock or report on flaws in the device that might help you remove the lock. But those locks are now integrated into devices as varied as your car, your pacemaker, your insulin pump, John Deere tractors, Boeing 747s. And we have exactly one methodology for learning whether or not someone's security mechanism works, and that's disclosure and adversarial peer review. That's the only thing we've found since the time of alchemy that actually works to winkle out the truth. And what we've done is we've created a regime in which security researchers who discover critical flaws in voting machines and your implanted defibrillator face felony prosecution for telling you about the problems with this. And at the same time, we enable dramatically anti-competitive behavior by a small number of firms who got there first at the expense of the wider economy. 4% of the US economy is service and repair. It's fixing your phone, fixing your car. It's not offshoreable. You don't send your car to China to get it fixed when it breaks. And those service centers are increasingly under the thumb of manufacturers. To fix a GM car, you have to have access to its informatics. To get access to its informatics, you have to use GM's tool, because circumventing them is a felony. GM's tool comes with the requirement that you only buy GM parts. And that means that GM can command monopoly rents on those parts and decide what innovation can and can't happen. The most extreme example of this is John Deere, who do centimeter accurate soil surveys using torque sensors on their wheels. They only give that information to Monsanto, not to the farmers. The only way to get automated seed broadcasting is to buy your seed from Monsanto. And then they use aggregated data to play the futures market because they have insight into crop yields. Well, bully for John Deere, but wouldn't it be nice if the farmers, who if anyone can be said to own that information, it's them, it's their fields, it's their tractor. Wouldn't it be nice if the farmers could avail themselves of a service that you invested in that gave them the legal right to look at information about their own property to allow them to exercise their property rights better? Those investment opportunities are enormous, and all we need to do is modify this law so that it doesn't punish removing a lock per se. It only punishes removing the lock to violate copyright.
Okay, so this is all, you're saying all of that is rooted in laws surrounding the internet itself. I mean, is that a perception that Google has? We have restraint on the internet, and these are unnecessary restraints?
I think one of the, I'm based in Washington, D.C., interesting phenomenon that we've seen is pieces of the law, like the ones that Cory is speaking about, digital rights management, technical protection measures, things that maybe 10 or 20 years ago, this like tiny universe of attorneys in Washington, D.C. would kind of be obsessively focused on. I think what's very rewarding, what we've seen from Google and the internet sector in Washington, is in the last few years, there's a tremendous awareness, I think, by the public and by users that these laws that can exert a tremendous amount of power into our lives, that can affect the way that we interact with online services on a daily basis, that the direction that those laws take is going to impact our daily lives. And we've seen a much broader universe of people that really care about those laws, that participate in them. I think on balance, we've seen in the United States a fairly good balance for copyright, one in which, today, I think thanks to the internet, there is more creativity happening today online. There's more books being, written. There's tremendous amounts of music. We are very invested in seeing policies that will enable that and won't restrict that. I think if you look at the global template around the world, there are things that are happening in places like Europe or through some of our trade agreements where there is a potential for the regulations to become tighter and for the internet to become more locked down, which is going to have very damaging consequences on things like free speech and competition and openness. So the balance is quite critical.
Setting aside, restrictive practices by the likes of Monsanto or whoever, Cory, I mean, isn't there an inherent conflict between the demands of freedom and the demands of privacy, for example?
I don't think so at all. I think that to the extent that we had markets that weren't intervened in by the states that put their thumbs on the scale against privacy, that people would over time be more likely to buy more privacy-enhancing technologies. We tend to think that the last year's massive privacy disclosures from the Office of Personnel Management and Ashley Madison and so on were the earthquake. They're really just the tremors. Those databases are relatively small and uninteresting compared to some of the databases held by private firms out there. And those firms are not any better defended than any of the other firms that we've seen breached. And what that means is that the major job of privacy advocates, which has historically been to convince people that they should care about their privacy, has shifted to making sure that the people who, with punctuated regularity over the years to come, will show up in their millions saying, my life was just destroyed by some horrific privacy breach, what can I do? To make sure that they come away from it saying, oh, well, I can use crypto, and I can make good choices about the technologies I use, and I can demand better from my lawmakers, and I can demand better from firms, rather than becoming privacy nihilists who say, well, there's nothing I can do. We live in the 21st century. It's a foregone conclusion. My data will hemorrhage all over. That's great news for privacy advocates, because convincing people to care about it was a job that we spectacularly failed at over decades, mostly for the same reason that people have a hard time convincing people not to smoke or eat too much cheesecake, because the activity is separated from its consequences by such an enormous amount of time and space that human beings have a hard time training their intuition. Pricing out the net present value of a future disclosure is really, really hard, right? We're not good at pricing risk. And as individuals, we're not good at pricing risk. And when firms take steps to make it hard for us to price that risk, if you look at Facebook's privacy dashboard, for example, it has all of those checkboxes. Blur your eyes a little, and they look like the lines on a crap table, right? They're there to confound your ability to calculate the odds, right? Proposition bets that have complicated odds only have complicated odds to make sure that you can't evaluate them. Proposition bets with simple odds, you can easily play out. And so industry has done everything it can to make it hard for us to train our intuition, but our intuition, unfortunately, is being trained by horrific, ghastly, regular, awful, life-destroying, in their millions privacy breaches that will only accelerate from here on in.
Katherine, I'm just going to... I'm sensing that there's an awful lot of you dying to get behind one of those mics, so if you want to, by all means, step up. Katherine, quickly then, we've got obviously big challenges to the search engines like Google and others from legislation. Most of it seems to come from Europe, but in terms of what can and can't be searched for, what you can and can't release through what you do, I mean, do you think that there is some kind of coordinated approach that is now being reached between, let's say, the US and Europe and everybody else, for that matter, about what we can and cannot disclose, how free we can be through engines like yours?
I think right now there's a really interesting dynamic happening between Europe and the United States. And so one of the key principles that we have in the US has kind of led the build out of internet policy and the internet framework under which we live today are certain principles, intermediary liability. So if you are an online platform, if you are YouTube or your social media network, your Facebook or Twitter, in the US we live under this principle that the platform itself is not going to be subject to legal lawsuits or made liable based on just what one user has done in a comment or a tweet or a post. And that freedom that the platforms have is critical for defending free expression, for the privacy of users today. And it's also really enabled, I think, venture capital investment into very new services that are startups that are only being created by a couple of people. It gives them legal certainty to attract investment. I think Europe has some very good instincts on this right now. They're undergoing an enormous review called the Digital Single Market Review. It has like 16 different work streams. And part of the goals of this review is to look at the European economy, look at the way the different nation states' economies work together, and figure out how to be more efficient. I do think there is a real potential for danger and harm. One of the work streams that just opened up in Europe, I think it was like September 23rd, is called platform consultation. And there have been some very, very worrying calls in that very early process of the review to shift from those kind of safeguards that we have under the US-style system, which is fairly in harmony right now in the EU, and to impose more duties of monitoring or filtering on these intermediary platforms to search more into what users are doing and to report things proactively. I think that we and many other platforms are very concerned if that consultation was to go in that direction. And it's early, and so hopefully they'll hear from their own European startup economy and their own users and citizens that that's not the direction, that's not helpful for Europe. But I do think that could really jeopardize the global reach that both US companies have into markets in Europe, and also really harm the potential for innovation and growth that Europe has when its startup economy is really only just beginning. So we'd love to see more harmony across the world and more protections globally for the types of behaviors that can happen on platforms rather than the other direction. If we're responsible for searching through those things, you're always going to have over-concern. The smaller the platform is, the more cautious you have to be so that you don't get sued, and the more quickly you would be to take something down, even if it's potentially innocent.
Cory.
Yeah, I mean, I have a theory of change about how we can make this all work, because a number of the worst policies that we have in the world of internet are actually creatures of the US Trade Representative. He's kind of patient zero of things like anti-circumvention and intermediary liability and surveillance, safe harbors, and so on. And as a result, you have all these countries whose industry sectors have agreed to avoid whole areas that are potentially profitable, like circumvention, right? Like adding a second store to Apple's mobile platform. And it's amazing to think that we have the government offering to spend an unlimited number of dollars to prevent industry from creating a second store that sells people software they can run on phones that they own free and clear, right? That decision to stay out of those markets will only be intact for so long as the US also agrees to uphold those restrictions, right? Suicide pacts are mutual. If the other guy is backing out, you don't go through it. And in the US, we are blessed with separation of powers, and in particular with an independent judiciary who are capable of making bad laws go away at the stroke of a pen if you can convince 5 judges that something wrong is going on here, that a law is unconstitutional, rather than a plurality of Congress. So this law, the DMCA, Section 1201, that prohibits circumvention devices, has been on the books since 1998. And every time we've had a good client who had a good case about why this was the wrong kind of law to have on the books and why it was plainly unconstitutional, the other side either declined to sue them or ran away when we stepped up to represent them. But now we have this target-rich environment. We have all of these businesses that are relying on Section 1201 to command rents that they can use to remit to their investors. And unlike the entertainment industry, which is playing an iterated game, right? If they lose DRM on this one DRM on music that they spent years developing, they'll make a new DRM for movies, right? And so they can afford to not sue one person who breaks one DRM if it means keeping DRM laws intact. And so they can pick and choose their battles. But if you look at Deere, John Deere has exactly one bet on DRM, and that's being able to own the global agricultural futures market for the rest of time. And they will sue no matter what, right? So in this target-rich environment, we can get the right kind of clients sued. And getting the right kind of clients sued means that over the 10 years that it will take to reach the Supreme Court, we will have this time in which the status of the law is indeterminate. Rather than being a thing where you go to your general counsel and say, I've just had some keen startup guys come up and show me this idea they have for a circumvention tool, looks like the market's really big, and your general counsel says all the jurisprudence goes the wrong way, your general counsel might say, well, if this one case prevails, you could be really rich, just like Airbnb, just like Uber. And that might be bets that people want to take. And if enough of those bets are taken between now and that Supreme Court case, we're going to have the evidence that we need to show the judges that if you allow people to make devices and tools that give them more rights to their own property, that the sky doesn't fall. In 1976, when they sued over the VCR, no one could tell whether the VCR would be good or bad for the film industry. By 1984, there were 6 million VCRs in American living rooms. And anyone who said the VCR as the Boston Strangler of the American film industry sounded like an asshole, right? And the judges handed the movie industry their asses. And so what we have as soon as this lawsuit starts is a 10-year clock for you guys to start investing in technologies and businesses that give people more rights to their property that will convince our bench that that's the right thing to do and that the sky doesn't fall. And that's how we're going to make it happen.
Okay, any litigious-minded VCs in the room can stand up and raise their hands. We have a question over here.
I'd like you to comment on the right to be forgotten, but also in the context of national boundaries and national laws. You started to talk about the difference between US and Europe. There are many things that we have, like air that we breathe, that cannot be constrained for an individual country. Multinationals are another one. What are the implications long-term as we end up with local and regional conflicts? How do we adjudicate this? What happens when, with the Microsoft case right now, with where the data lives, does that matter, and what countries have rights? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on those various areas.
Both thoughts.
Well, it's definitely a Katie question.
Katherine,
more
go
than me.
first. Go first.
Yeah, I think you're raising many challenging questions that policymakers in a variety of countries, are very concerned about. We are a U.S. company, but much of our revenue is gained abroad. Many of our users and our viewers are abroad. I was looking at the numbers even just for Europe, and I think something like for YouTube, 25% of the content that's consumed on YouTube, there's over 1 billion users that come to YouTube every month. They're actually based in Europe. And so I think we do have a concern that over time, a more and more fragmented internet will be a very dangerous thing. And we are seeing attempts in many different countries to exert kind of unilateral control over the internet. And that's one of the pieces that's at tension in the right to be forgotten. One of the things that we're fighting today in France is the notion that just one country can exert control over what users and internet viewers all around the world can see. So there is, we have to live under the laws for the jurisdiction in which we operate. We have built out a system to comply with the right to be forgotten. If you're an EU citizen, we will remove content for the EU. Right now, what the challenge that's brewing in France is whether we also need to remove that globally. And so US citizens also wouldn't be allowed to see that content, even though under US law, that would be actually fine. So that's something that we, will continue to fight. But of course, we do have to comply with the laws wherever we operate, and that's why I think the very first thing that I said, that we are heartened to see a broader diversity of perspectives that are able to influence these types of laws. People think of copyright as a very technical thing, but it can literally affect, all the information that you're able to see, or whether a platform can live or die. And so I think the broader perspectives in all of these countries, the more citizens that get engaged in this, the more likely we are to continue to have this fluid system on the internet rather than fragmented. And data flows, I think, which you mentioned as well, the free flow of information is also critical there. If we are required to drop a server, you know, in any potential jurisdiction, that really is a huge drawback. The beauty of the internet is you can be a small-time provider, you can be a creator. Like one of my favorite stories that I just came across very recently is a woman based in Hamilton, Missouri, and she was undergoing a lot of business challenges, and she's also a quilter, so she started making these quilting videos on YouTube. And her channel today has 250,000 subscribers. She's hired like 180 people out of her 1,800 town. It's now like a tourist destination for quilting. So like one very specific example, but we're seeing this all over the world where because the barriers to entry have lowered, there's lower costs, you can have a great idea, you can film something at home, and you can launch a global business. We want those opportunities to exist, not just for US-based creators, but for people that have a voice or have a good business idea, you know, anywhere in the world.
But you're at risk of any one small country. I mean, you know, a large corporation could buy a small country, and have that country put draconian laws out that says that affects what happens elsewhere, just like what France is doing in the U.S. And unless there is some mechanism to prevent that from being necessary for you to follow globally, we get to the least restricted, or excuse me, we are constrained by the most constricted regulations globally that anyone wants to put on.
So that's not entirely true, because jurisdiction only binds where there's either a treaty in place that allows for a collection of remedies across borders, or where a company has opted to put a sales office or some other office within the territory of that court. So we do have another alternative, right? If there are countries that have national security letters, maybe you shouldn't store your users' data in those countries. If there are countries that require that you not criticize the king like Thailand does, maybe you shouldn't have anyone that the Thai government can arrest in Thailand while you do that. Google did it with China, right? They left China. It's the right decision to make if what you care about is your users and the free flow of information. If you are more concerned with a kind of short-term, quarterly return on investment that's driven by having a sales office in all of those places, then it's the wrong decision to make. But long-term, you're right. Having a sales office in every jurisdiction lets every pick-speak tyrant in every country with a crappy constitution dictate global information flows, and that's bad for the long-term health of any big firm.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
Cory, have you looked into anything about defamation in companies like Yelp? Any laws nationally or statewide?
Well, in the U.S., you know, there's federal law. There's the Communications Decency Act, and it exempts it exempts platforms from liability for most bad speech from users with a fairly light touch compliance regime. As these things go, it's not so bad. In the U.K., where I lived until this summer, we had some very bad libel laws that have inched minutely towards something a little bit better. Yelp has problems, right? And not just Yelp, Ripoff Report, and a lot of other sites have real problems with how they operate. And those problems are probably not helped by making platforms responsible for the opinions of their users. You know, hard cases make bad laws. And when you have things like Yelp, where firms engage in anti-competitive behavior against one another by leaving bad reviews for one another, or you have malicious individuals, and they're engaged in what amounts to tortious interference with one another, making the firm police that is crazy, right? It's full employment for all tort lawyers until the heat death of the universe, right? Because there are so many places in which that kind of tortious interference can take place that if the intermediary liability is high enough that getting it wrong is business killing, then you basically have to hire building after building full of lawyers to review user comments before they can go live. It's a microcosm of the copyright problem. You know, Viacom, when they sued Google over YouTube, argued that Google should have lawyers review all of the video that went live on YouTube. It's now up to, I think, 196 hours a minute, right? Before it went live to make sure it didn't infringe copyright. And this is a standard to which no firm could rise. And it basically makes firms like YouTube, which now have these big automated services for doing automated copyright enforcement with a fair number of dolphins in the tuna net, it must be said, makes them the last firm that's ever going to be able to do a video startup, because it's no longer the case that you can start a video startup with 3 guys, a garage, and a lot of hard drives. Now you also have to have a couple $100 million worth of compliance technology to satisfy the entertainment industry. And that means that no one is going to come forward to compete with YouTube, which means that as an entertainer, as someone who makes his living making content, I have fewer intermediaries who I can bring my work out to the public with, which means that I end up in a buyer's market for my content, not a seller's market, which means that they can set terms. And we saw this with YouTube this year. YouTube started a streaming music service to compete with Spotify and Pandora, and they gathered the 4 big record labels into a room and negotiated terms for licensing their content and putting it in the streaming service. And then they handed down terms that the 4 labels had set to all the independents, all the small labels and independent musicians, and said, you will abide by these terms, or you are no longer allowed to use YouTube to promote your music in any way, right? You are no longer allowed to upload content to YouTube. When you reduce the amount of sellers or intermediaries in the market, you make the new boss the same as the old boss, and you do it at the expense of the suppliers into those sales channels, which is the entertainers. And the same is true when we have markets, other kinds of markets for speech, like markets for reviews, where reducing the number of entities who have platforms in which individual humans can tell each other about their experiences with vendors doesn't make those vendors in a better position. It means that the firms that control those reviews become less numerous and more powerful and more able to exercise arbitrary authority over the firms whose material is being reviewed.
I think they should pass some pretty strong laws that allow people and companies, mom and pop restaurants, to be able to refute defamation on sites like Yelp, and there are many, many more.
So right of reply is
on those sites, they make it virtually, like you were talking about, small print and privacy earlier.
Right.
They make it virtually impossible for someone to refute defamation on that same site so that reviewers can read that. And I think there should be some strong laws passed for that ability of those people to be able to respond.
So in the jurisdictions where we tried right of reply, it has worked very badly. But it's a thing to look at, right? So if you're going to propose a regulatory intervention, we should look at how it's performed in the field before, because we've had right of reply in news media, and it hasn't provided the remedy that we wanted the little guy to have. Instead, what it's been is it's a cudgel that's been wielded by people who already have a lot of power against news entities who reported true things. And so what and generally speaking, when you create extraordinary interventions into speech markets, those interventions are more accessible to people who already have a lot of power, right? The law is expensive, right? And so mom and pops, if they can sue for the right to show that the firm, that the platform didn't feature their reply, in a prominent enough way, they have to have the funds to sue. Right? And so it's unlikely that the mom and pops are going to be the ones that get that. I mean, they already have a remedy in the form of tortious interference lawsuits. And we don't see a lot of those being brought because they lack the funds. They lack the funds to bring a tortious interference lawsuit, so they will also lack the funds to bring a lawsuit over their right of reply. And what you'll end up with is giant companies replicating the McLibel thing, where McDonald's was able to bankrupt activists who made true statements about McDonald's practices in livestock rearing and sourcing. And they were able to bankrupt them through a decade-long legal battle, which they ultimately lost, but they won because they had access to the courts, and they were able to basically make these individuals' lives a living hell. Right? So you need a remedy that works, not just a remedy that makes you feel good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, very briefly, presumably Yelp has a corporate interest because it'll just become a vehicle for libel, right? If that was all it was a vehicle for, or at least if there was a kind of critical mass of untruths being, then presumably there's a corporate interest for the company to actually in some way I don't know, improve it.
So the question is
platform.
Yelp's equilibrium between truth and falsehood the same as any individual firm's optimal equilibrium, right? I don't think it is. I mean, I think Yelp, as a platform that makes money, can probably be profitable with a set point for policing its users' content that's much further along the people say dumb, crappy, lying stuff than any individual firm that's destroyed by it, right? I mean, I think that's probably true. They have mismatched incentives. So I don't think that this is a place where markets themselves will sort it. And I don't discount the possibility that regulatory intervention will solve it. I just think right of reply has not worked thus far. And so if you have a proposal for right of reply, you should be able to articulate some way in which your right of reply solves the problems earlier rights of reply didn't.
Absolutely, and the concept of republication, historically in England, United States, when you defame someone and you republish that in a newspaper, the republisher, has always been liable under certain rules, opinion, a lot of exceptions to that.
Right. I mean, in the US, libel has never really been accessible to people because of the First Amendment. In the UK, it's been a complete disaster where chiropractors can sue scientists for saying that they can't cure cancer by waving their hands at people.
Don't get us started on the British libel laws. We'll be here forever. I'm afraid we're done. We're past our time. I'm very sorry about that because you sense that we could be here for a long time if we wanted to be. Thank you very much indeed.